The wind had already turned cold that afternoon in Murdock, Maine. It was October 1992, and the trees around the town's only elementary school stood bare, their branches scratching at the gray sky like they knew something the rest of the town didn't. At precisely 2:45, the final bell echoed to the hallways of Murdock Elementary. Students spilled out into the parking lot, laughing, shouting, some clutching backpacks, others chasing each other to the rows of yellow buses. But one boy didn't walk out. He ran. Thomas Riley, 11 years old, had just left the principal's office. He'd been in trouble for the very first time in his short life. Earlier that day, he had gotten into an argument with another student on the playground. Shoves were exchanged, voices raised, and the whole school seemed to hear it. For Thomas, who was usually quiet and polite, it had come as a shock to his teachers. No one could quite believe he had lost his temper. Even less expected was his reaction after being scolded. He didn't cry, didn't sulk. He simply bolted. A lunch monitor saw him disappear around the corner of the building, heading away from the buses, toward the far edge of the schoolyard where the woods began. She shouted his name, but Thomas didn't stop. He vanished between the trees, swallowed by the thicket just beyond the chain-link fence. At first, no one panicked. Teachers assumed he had gone home early. His mother thought he had stayed late. It wasn't until 7 that evening, when both parents called the school in rising panic, that the truth became clear. Thomas never came home. By nightfall, local police were on the scene. Flashlights cut through the trees, dogs barked, and volunteers shouted Thomas's name into the gathering dark. The search went on for days, then weeks. The forest was combed inch by inch. The riverbank was dragged. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Even the storm drains near the school were checked. But no sign of Thomas Riley was ever found. He had simply disappeared. The town of Murdock, with fewer than 5,000 residents, was shaken to its core. Posters went up on telephone poles, store windows, even taped to gas station pumps. A hotline was set up. The local diner offered free coffee to searchers. For months, nothing else was talked about. People whispered theories in the aisles of the hardware store. Some said he'd run away for good. Others thought he'd been taken. But no one had any proof. As the first winter snow fell in December, the posters began to fade. The hotline rang less. The volunteers stopped meeting every morning. Life reluctantly moved on. By the summer of 1993, the Rileys sold their house. They couldn't bear to stay. The empty bedroom, the untouched cereal bowls, the school photo on the fridge, it was all too much. They left Murdock behind, moving downstate to live near relatives. Every year, they sent a Christmas card to the Murdock Police Department, asking if there was any news. Every year, the answer was the same. Nothing. Murdock Elementary, the last place Thomas had been seen, stayed open for another 10 years. But enrollment dwindled and the building aged. By the early 2000s, the roof leaked, the heating system failed, and budget cuts sealed its fate. In 2004, the school closed its doors for good. From then on, the building stood silent, windows boarded up, playground rusting, vines creeping over the faded brick. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside on Halloween. Sometimes, people claimed they heard footsteps echoing through the halls at night, or saw movement behind the old curtains. But no one really believed. No one, that is, until 31 years later. In the spring of 2023, the Murdock Town Council sold the land to a real estate developer based out of Portland. Plans were approved to tear down the old school and replace it with a modern housing complex. 62 units, green spaces, underground parking. Demolition began in April. For weeks, bulldozers clawed the walls, tearing down classrooms and locker bays. Then, one afternoon, something strange happened in the basement. The demolition crew had reached the lower levels of the building, where the old boiler room and maintenance tunnels sat beneath layers of dust. Most of the area had been stripped bare, pipes removed, tiles shattered, rusted lockers tossed into dumpsters. But when they began chipping away at a back wall made of thick concrete, one of the workers hit something hollow. It was subtle, a difference in the echo, a faint vibration in the air. They paused the work. The foreman leaned in and tapped the wall again. Hollow saws were brought in, then jackhammers. The concrete gave way with effort, revealing something behind it, a narrow cavity barely wide enough for a child. The opening was less than 3 feet high and pitch black inside. When the dust cleared, one of the crew members leaned in with a flashlight and froze. There, at the very back of the space, sitting against the wall as if placed with care, was a faded blue backpack, and beside it, a small red flashlight, still intact, still carrying batteries that had long since corroded. There were other objects, too, a notebook, a worn-out pencil, snack wrappers, even a tiny, cracked mirror. The walls inside the cavity were marked up with drawings, some childish, others more frantic. But what caught everyone's attention were the numbers. Someone had drawn a vertical line along the back wall and marked it at intervals, each with a date beside it. The first was October 22nd, 1992. The last, October 31st. 9 marks. 9 days. By the time the police arrived, the crew had stopped work entirely. The site was sealed off. News helicopters circled overhead. And within hours, the story broke online. Objects linked to missing boy Thomas Riley found behind wall of abandoned school. People who had grown up in Murdoch came back to see it for themselves. The Rileys were contacted immediately. Now in their 60s, they returned for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Standing at the edge of the crater where the building once stood, Thomas's mother covered her mouth as the police showed her what had been found. The blue backpack. She remembered it clearly. She had bought it for him just weeks before he vanished. And inside the notebook, in small, uneven handwriting, were 2 initials. TR. The notebook was handed over to forensics, sealed in a plastic evidence bag that now rested on a long metal table in the county sheriff's office. Every page was photographed and scanned, though most of the writing had faded from years of dampness and dust. Still, a few entries remained legible. They were written in a child's hand, uneven and pressed deep into the paper, as if the pencil had been worn down with desperation. I hear them upstairs. I think they're looking for me. I don't want to come out yet. That was the first line. The second page was mostly scribbles, simple drawings of trees, a school building, and stick figures. On the third page, Thomas had drawn a clock with no hands. Below it, another message. I think I made a mistake. It's darker today. No flashlight. I hope Mom isn't mad. Those pages haunted the investigators. They pointed to a single theory. Thomas had hidden himself, possibly to avoid punishment or out of fear. But he'd never intended to stay long. Something must have gone wrong. He'd gotten trapped. And no one, not teachers, not janitors, not even police, had thought to search behind a sealed maintenance wall in the school's basement. It was a simple mistake. A door that had once led to the sublevel was permanently locked in 1991 during renovations. The maintenance access had been forgotten. Records were incomplete. And back in those days, school security wasn't what would become decades later. That forgotten corridor, out of sight and out of mind, had become a silent tomb. Detective Lisa Granger, now in her 50s, was assigned to the reopened case. She'd been a rookie officer in Murdoch back in '92 and remembered the search all too well. She recalled walking the woods with a flashlight, calling out Thomas's name into the dark, never imagining he was still within the school walls the whole time. She stood in the ruins of the school, now just broken concrete and exposed rebar, and stared into the small, claustrophobic cavity. The air smelled of rust and earth. The walls bore Thomas's height marks, all carefully dated. Some had little notes next to them. Tuesday, felt dizzy, heard music. It was a slow, heartbreaking timeline of isolation. Did no one hear him? Granger asked aloud, her voice quiet. A construction worker beside her shook his head. If he called out, no one answered. The forensic team confirmed that no human remains were found. There was no trace of blood, no signs of struggle, just dust, the scent of old mold, and those heartbreaking artifacts of a boy who'd once laughed and run through these very halls. By late April, the story had spread beyond Maine. National outlets picked it up. Old footage from 1992 played on the evening news. Interviews with tearful classmates. The sheriff at the time, even aerial shots of the school grounds. Social media buzzed with speculation, and dozens of amateur sleuths flooded the town with questions. But no theory could change the facts. Thomas had gone into hiding, and he had never come out. What puzzled everyone, though, was the flashlight. It was an old model with a red grip, standard for that era, but it looked placed, not dropped, not tossed. It was sitting upright, almost deliberately, as though someone, possibly Thomas, had set it down carefully. The battery compartment was sealed. When technicians opened it, they found the batteries inside had corroded, but not leaked. It was a small detail, but it told them something. Thomas may have used a flashlight for several days before it died. He hadn't been plunged into darkness right away. That meant he had time. Time to wait. Time to hope someone would come. Time to realize no one was coming. The markings on the wall stopped on Halloween, October 31st. What happened then was unclear. The theories multiplied. Some believe he tried to escape and became trapped deeper in the infrastructure. Others wondered if he had found a second exit that collapsed or was sealed during the renovation. But without a body or clear trail, nothing could be confirmed. Then 1 week later, an anonymous call came into the station. A man's voice, elderly, calm, careful with his words. He had seen the news report and recognized the location where the backpack was found. He explained that he had worked at Murdoch Elementary in the early 90s as a part-time maintenance assistant. He had retired shortly before Thomas went missing. There was a second staircase, the man said, led down to the sublevel. We used it during inspections. It was hidden behind the east janitor's closet. Granger froze. She asked if the entrance had been marked on any blueprints. The man sighed. Doubt it. We locked it up in '91 after a leak. Water damage. No one used that part of school again. The call was traced to a retirement community in Bangor. Granger drove out the next morning and met the man, Walter Simmons, 87 years old. He walked with a cane and had a memory full of sharp edges. He drew a rough sketch of the basement level on a notepad, labeling corners and doorways with astonishing accuracy. When Granger showed him the police photos of the cavity, he nodded slowly. That's the old supply nook, he said. Used to keep emergency rations in there during the Cold War. If you can believe that. We walled it off after some kids got in and broke a pipe, sealed it with concrete. I helped mix it myself. She stared at him. Do you remember the day Thomas disappeared? Walter nodded again, this time slower. I do. I was off that day. But I remember hearing they couldn't find him. He paused, looking down. I always wondered if someone checked the basement. Back at the demolition site, Granger and the crew returned to the old east janitor's closet. The wall had already been knocked down by the machinery, but beneath the rubble they found it, rusted metal hinges embedded in the floor. Traces of what had once been a narrow staircase, long since filled in with concrete. A hidden access point, forgotten by time. The school had literally buried its own secret. Further inspection revealed something else. Small, artificial vents hidden behind molding. They had been intended to circulate air during emergencies, but it clogged over the years with dust and debris. It was possible, investigators said, that faint sounds, shouts, banging cries could have been muffled almost entirely, meaning Thomas might have screamed, and no one heard. In early May, Thomas's belongings were returned to his family. His mother held the backpack in her lap for a long time, running her fingers along the frayed zipper. His father, now graying and quiet, opened the notebook and stopped on the page with the clock. He was waiting, he whispered. He thought we'd come. Neither of them spoke much after that, but they stayed in Murdoch a little longer than expected. They visited the demolition site once more before leaving town. Standing together by the edge of the rubble, they left a single item behind, a small wooden plaque. It read, Thomas Riley, you were here, and now so are we. The demolition halted indefinitely. The construction company, under public pressure and media scrutiny, agreed to pause all work until investigators finished combing through every remaining square foot of the foundation. For the first time in over 3 decades, people weren't trying to forget what had happened at Murdoch Elementary. They were trying to understand it. By mid-May, Detectives brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan what remained of the sub-basement. Though the majority had already been destroyed, the eastern quadrant was still partially intact. That's where they made the second discovery. Behind another section of concrete, barely 10 feet from where Thomas's belongings were found, the radar picked up a void. Crews carefully removed the surrounding structure, and what they uncovered chilled even the most seasoned investigators. It was another cavity, much like the first, only this one was larger, with signs that had been intentionally sealed at 2 different points in time. One layer of concrete had been poured in the early 90s, and another, thinner layer had been added later, possibly during repairs in the early 2000s. Inside this space were more objects: an old folding chair, a small radio, broken, a stack of dusty comic books, each missing its cover, and, pinned to the far wall with a thumbtack, a single Polaroid photograph. The image had faded almost completely, but it showed a classroom, Room 14, based on a placard barely visible in the top corner. And sitting at one of the desks was a boy, blonde hair, striped shirt, smiling at the camera. It was Thomas, but no one knew who had taken the picture. The Rylas confirmed it wasn't from their family collection. Neither parent recalled ever seeing it. It wasn't part of the school yearbook, either. Local records couldn't produce a copy. The origin of the photo became the new center of speculation. Had Thomas brought it with him? Had someone taken it while he was hiding? Or, unsettlingly, had someone been with him? For Detective Granger, the possibility reopened everything. She requested access to sealed maintenance logs and staff rosters from years before and after the incident. Most of the records were in storage at the Murdoch District Archives, yellowing and fragile. As she sorted through the pages, one name stood out, not because it was suspicious, but because it kept appearing in different roles. A man named Kenneth Dorman. He had worked at the school in various part-time positions from 1988 until 1993. Janitorial work, groundskeeping, minor repairs. Nothing serious. No formal complaints, no red flags. But there was something strange. In the weeks following Thomas's disappearance, Dorman had submitted his resignation unexpectedly and left Murdoch altogether. Granger tracked him down to a small town in Vermont, where he lived quietly retired and mostly kept to himself. She paid him a visit. He answered the door with a polite but guarded expression. When she introduced herself and explained why she was there, his face went still. "I figured this might come back one day," he said softly. Granger asked if he remembered the maintenance areas under the school. He did. She asked if he ever saw Thomas Riley on the day he disappeared. He paused, then gave a slow nod. "Running," he said, "through the east hallway, toward the janitor's closet." He claimed he was in the boiler room at the time, checking a pressure gauge, when he saw the boy through a small observation window. "I thought he was playing," Dorman said, "or hiding from someone. Kids did that sometimes. I figured he'd come out." But he never did. Granger pressed further. Why hadn't he reported it? Dorman shrugged, eyes lowered. "I told the principal I saw him in the hallway. That was it. I didn't think it mattered." When she mentioned a photograph found behind the wall, something flickered in his expression. "I didn't take it," he said firmly. "I didn't even know he was down there." Granger studied his face. It was impossible to tell if he was lying, but something about his tone felt rehearsed, too precise. Later that week, she pulled the original incident report from 1992. Nowhere in the file did it mention Kenneth Dorman telling anyone he'd seen Thomas that day. In fact, he hadn't even been interviewed. His name appeared only once, in a log noting he had signed out of work at 3:15, the same time search efforts began. That omission changed everything. Granger returned to the ruins of the school, now covered in tarps and caution tape. She walked the full perimeter, stopping where the east janitor's closet used to be. Something about it still bothered her. If Thomas had gone through that closet, why hadn't they found evidence of it earlier? Why had that area remained untouched, even during the original search? The answer, she realized, might lie in how the school handled its own records. Back at the archive building, she pulled blueprints and renovation permits from 1991, and there it was, a maintenance report showing the closure of the east staircase, and a request to seal the lower access point permanently due to student safety concerns. The request was signed by Kenneth Dorman. She stared at the signature. He hadn't just seen Thomas run. He had known exactly where the boy had gone, and he had submitted the paperwork that ultimately sealed that access point weeks before Thomas's disappearance. Granger returned to Vermont with a warrant for a full interview, but when she arrived, Dorman was gone. His home was empty. A neighbor said he'd packed up 2 days earlier, mentioning a trip to see family in upstate New York. But no forwarding address was given. Granger filed a formal request to track his financial activity. Credit cards, bank withdrawals, travel logs. For now, the search was unofficial, but it was growing. Back in Murdoch, the second cavity was examined in detail. Forensic analysts uncovered something chilling. Fibers embedded in the wall, matching fabric from the same type of blue-striped shirt Thomas had worn in his school photo. They also found a faint outline of another object once present in the space. Something square, metallic, about the size of a lunchbox. But it was gone. Stolen. Or moved. The theory forming now was more complex. Yes, Thomas had run. Yes, he'd hidden. But someone may have known. Someone may have found him. And instead of rescuing him, they left him there, or worse, watched him stay. The town of Murdoch, once a quiet, foggied on the main map, had become the center of something much darker. And as summer approached, it was clear the discovery behind the wall was just a beginning, because something else was still out there. Something, or someone, who knew the truth. By early June, the case had fully transitioned from a cold file into an active investigation. The FBI was now involved, though unofficially. No crime had been confirmed, no body, no conclusive evidence of foul play. But the circumstances surrounding the sealed basement cavities and the disappearance of Kenneth Dorman were enough to raise federal eyebrows. Detective Granger spent nearly every day poring over old interview tapes, trying to find missed details. She had grown quiet, focused, obsessive, some said, but she knew she was closing in. Her next lead came from an unexpected source, a former student. His name was Ethan Larrabee, now in his 40s, who had attended Murdoch Elementary in the early 90s. He had moved away shortly after 5th grade, but when the news broke about Thomas's backpack, Ethan contacted the local police. He remembered something strange. It was the day after Thomas disappeared, Ethan said. Everyone was buzzing about it. Teachers were whispering. But I remember seeing Mr. Dorman in the hallway. He looked weird. Granger asked what he meant. He was carrying a box, like a metal one, kind of dented. He kept looking over his shoulder. I thought it was part of his janitor stuff, but later I saw him again. He was standing by the east wing door, the one that led down the basement, just standing there like he was waiting for someone. Ethan had never told anyone. At the time, it didn't seem important. But now, 31 years later, that memory came back with crystal clarity. Granger pressed further. Do you remember what color the box was? Gray, Ethan said, with a red latch. I think it had stickers on it, like superhero stuff. That matched the description given by Thomas's mother. She'd said Thomas kept his trading cards in an old metal lunchbox, gray with red trim, covered in superhero stickers. The same lunchbox forensic analysts had theorized had once been inside the second cavity, now missing. The implication hit hard. Not only had Dorman known Thomas was in the basement, he may have removed evidence from the scene. Or worse, interacted with Thomas during those 9 days. Back at the site, the investigation took another turn. Construction had remained suspended, and Granger received permission to bring in a specialized sonar imaging team from Boston. They scanned beneath the eastern edge of the foundation, an area that hadn't been fully excavated due to utility lines. That's when they found the third void. It was deeper than the others. Longer, almost like a tunnel. The team began removing the top layer of dirt and broken tile. After several hours of careful work, they broke through a thin concrete crust and uncovered the entrance to what appeared to be an old service corridor, likely dating back to the original school plans from the 1950s. Inside, they found more debris, dust-covered pipes, broken shelves, abandoned cleaning supplies. But further down, near the far end of the tunnel, they came across something else. A small metal locker. Inside was a blanket, now tattered and gray with time. A plastic thermos. A few coins from the early 90s. And tucked into the corner, wrapped in wax paper, was a folded note. It read, "He said I have to stay here. He brings me food. I miss the sky." The handwriting matched the notebook found earlier. It was Thomas's. The note shifted the case dramatically. If accurate, it meant Thomas hadn't just hidden in the basement. He had been kept there. Someone had been coming and going, bringing him food, perhaps even promising he'd be allowed out soon. And then they stopped. A criminal profile was commissioned. The profile painted a disturbing possibility. Someone with access to the building, possibly in a position of trust. Someone who could move around without suspicion. Likely male, likely older. Someone who knew the building well and how to manipulate a frightened child. And someone who could disappear without leaving a trace. Granger returned to Vermont once more, hoping to find any trace of Dorman. His accounts had gone quiet. No card activity. No phone calls. No confirmed sightings. Until a surveillance image came in from northern New Hampshire. A man matching Dorman's description had been seen entering a pawn shop in Lancaster. He sold an old radio and a metal lunchbox, gray, dented, with red trim and worn stickers. He signed the receipt using a different name. Granger left that same night, reaching Lancaster just before dawn. But Dorman was gone again. The lunchbox was retrieved. Inside were old baseball cards, a few gum wrappers, and a slip of paper with handwriting. "Don't forget the story we made up, about the Fort Underground. That's where we live now." This wasn't just a message. It was a fragment of a game, a narrative, something a child might cling to while scared and alone. Back in Murdoch, residents began visiting the site more frequently. The temporary memorial grew. Flowers, stuffed animals, drawings. Many were from adults who had once been children there. Guilt hung heavy in the air, even for those who hadn't been involved. Everyone felt it now, the weight of a boy who had been so close all along. A local woman named Diane Murray, who had taught 4th grade at Murdoch Elementary, stepped forward with a new memory. "I remember Thomas telling me once that he liked secret places," she said. "He said he built forts in the woods behind his house. And once, he told me something strange. He said there was a secret room under the school." Granger asked what she had said in response. "I told him not to believe stories like that there was no secret room. But he insisted. He said someone showed him." Someone, the word echoed. In her office, Granger laid out all the evidence on a corkboard. Photos, maps, timelines. There were gaps, of course, but now a clearer shape was forming. A boy with an adventurous heart. A secret space beneath an aging school. A trusted adult who didn't sound alarms. And 9 days in darkness. Her question had changed. It was no longer, "Where did Thomas go?" It was, "Why did no one stop it?" And now, is someone still trying to hide what happened? As June faded into July, construction remained halted. The town split between those wanting to move on and those demanding the truth. But one thing was certain. Thomas Riley had been closer than anyone imagined. And someone, somewhere, still knew more than they had said. July brought storms to Murdoch. Heavy rain swept through the old school grounds, pooling in the crater left by the demolition and carving shallow rivers through the exposed foundation. But beneath the weather and mud, a deeper current stirred. Unease. The town no longer looked at the old school as a ruin. It had become a wound, one not yet closed. Detective Lisa Granger had spent nearly 4 months unraveling the threads of a mystery that had slept under her nose for most of her career. And now, for the first time, she had more than fragments. She had a name, a timeline, a pattern, but still no resolution. Kenneth Dorman remained missing. No additional sightings. No phone activity. It was as if he had dissolved. But the evidence he left behind was damning in its silence. The lunchbox, the photograph, the note about the Fort Underground. And now, a new discovery, brought forward by a retired construction inspector named Barry Leland. He'd been involved in the 1991 renovations at Murdoch Elementary, working as an outside contractor. When he saw the news reports about the hidden cavities in the school's layout, something clicked. "I remember that wall," he said during a taped interview. "We were told not to touch it, just reinforce the doorframe and leave the interior alone." Granger leaned forward. "Who gave that order?" Leland hesitated. "I don't remember exactly, but I think it came from inside the school, from the maintenance guy. He wore this canvas vest, had a patch with his name." Granger already knew what he would say next. "Dorman? Yeah, that's it, Dorman." The timeline now aligned too well to ignore. In 1991, a year before Thomas vanished, Dorman had taken steps to isolate a space beneath the school. A year later, a boy disappeared, last seen running toward that same corridor. And days after the search began, Dorman left his job and left town. But the most haunting detail had yet to come. During a final sweep of the tunnel where the folded note had been found, ground radar revealed a narrow crawl space behind a rusted support panel. Investigators removed it carefully. Behind it, in the lowest, darkest corner of the sub-basement, they found what could only be described as a small makeshift room. No door, no ventilation, no light source. But inside, perfectly preserved due to the cold and stillness, was something everyone had feared and no one had wanted to find. A child's shoe, tiny, scuffed, blue with 2 white stripes along the side. Thomas's mother identified it immediately. "That was his gym pair," she whispered. "He always wore them without socks." Forensics confirmed the match. And next to the shoe, in a shallow groove along the floor, was a final drawing etched in the concrete using what appeared to be a sharpened coin. It was a picture of a house. A little 2-story home with a picket fence and a sun above it. Standing in the doorway was a boy. Alone. Smiling. No signature. Just the image. The forensic team could not determine exactly how Thomas's life had ended. There were no remains, and the underground moisture had likely scattered organic evidence long ago. But the conclusion was now clear. Thomas Riley had remained beneath the school, not just for days, possibly for weeks. And whether through isolation, injury, or abandonment, he never made it out. When the case file was officially reclassified, it was no longer listed as a missing persons report. It became non-criminal death, circumstances unconfirmed. But for Granger and the people of Murdoch, that label was a hollow echo of what they now knew. In a final attempt to uncover more, Granger petitioned to interview the original principal of Murdoch Elementary, now retired and living in assisted care. His memory had faded with age, but when shown a photo of Thomas, he brightened. "He was a sweet boy," he said, "always reading, always building things." When asked about Dorman, the man frowned. "That one was quiet," he said. "Too quiet. I remember thinking he was strange around the boiler room. Once told me he'd found a raccoon trapped under the floor. But when I went down to check, I didn't see anything." Granger asked when that happened. He thought carefully. Maybe a week before the boy went missing? It wasn't much, but it confirmed Dorman had been alone in the basement during the critical period. In August, the town council voted unanimously to turn the old school grounds into a memorial garden. The housing project was canceled. A granite bench was installed at the site, engraved with the words, "In memory of the lost and the silence we didn't break." At the dedication ceremony, Thomas's parents stood quietly as a small group gathered. No speeches, just wind, and the sound of leaves brushing together like pages in a story no one finished reading. After the ceremony, Granger approached them. She had something to return. Thomas's notebook. It had been dried, preserved, and bound in a protective case. Inside, between the pages, was a small photo she had found folded and pressed flat in the thermos discovered earlier. It showed Thomas and another boy laughing on a school field. It had likely been taken by a teacher in early '92. The other boy's name was written on the back. Ethan Larrabee. Granger contacted him again. When asked if he remembered the photo, he said he didn't. But when she mailed it to him, he called her within the hour. "I think I remember this now," he said. "I think we made a promise that day. "What kind of promise?" she asked. He was quiet a long time. "That we build a fort so secret that no one could ever find it. Just for us." Granger said nothing. There was nothing more to say. The final report was filed, the evidence sealed, and though no one could officially prove who had been responsible, everyone knew what had been hidden and what had been lost. Weeks later, as summer gave way to early fall, a young boy walking to the new memorial garden with his mother noticed something odd along the base of the old foundation wall. A square of concrete, slightly different in color. He knelt beside it, and there, etched in with nail or stone, barely visible in the afternoon light, were 3 letters. "Tiar." He looked up at his mother. "Who's that?" She knelt beside him. "Someone we forgot to find," she said. "But not anymore." And for a moment, in the breeze between the trees, the garden seemed to breathe, not with peace, but with memory.